Good evening, everybody. So glad that all of you who are here could join us tonight. I think we're in for a real treat. I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Sussman, who is the author of, I thought 9 books, but I have been informed that he is the author of 15 amazing books, and there are more to come. We think we know so much about the history of the Holocaust, but Jeffrey came across a little known, fascinating, and really devastating knowledge about the fighters in German concentration camps, and wrote a really amazing book that I don't think many people are aware of this story. I know that we're going to learn a lot tonight, and I think we're very lucky to have Jeffrey join us and tell us this story that is new to probably, I would love to know, Jeffrey, at the end, if there's anybody out there listening tonight who did know of this in advance. I think probably not, but let's welcome Jeffrey Sussman. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Francine. It was a very nice introduction.
Thank you.
Here's a cover of the book. I just thought I would show it to all of you but before I begin talking about it. The book is called Holocaust Fighters, Boxers, Resistors, and Avengers. And as Francine mentioned, I got interested in this while I was initially doing research on another book about boxers. I came across a man named Harry Haft, who boxed after the war in this country briefly, but he had 76 bouts in the Nazi concentration camp Auschwitz. And when I learned about him, I wanted to find out if there were other men who were in the same position and had to suffer the way he did. And I found out that there were a number of them. And I investigated all of them, and I felt compelled to write this book about it because it was such a fascinating subject. It was also a rather depressing subject, but nevertheless, I couldn't avoid it. Once it grabbed hold of me, it just wouldn't let go. So I'd like to start by talking about the first person who I did some research about and discovered. His name was Victor Young Perez. He was a Jew from Tunis who trained as a young man in a boxing gym in Tunis called the Maccabee Gym. And he was very proficient at this. And he decided that he would like to have a career as a professional boxer. However, he didn't think that Tunis was the place where his career would take off. So he emigrated to Paris and settled in there, and quickly rose in the ranks of prize fighters and became, in fact, the youngest flyweight boxing champion of Europe. He was only 19 at the time. And he became a celebrity and began an affair with a woman who was a major film star in French cinema at that time. Her name was Mireille Ballin, and they became lovers, and they became a celebrity couple. They were often photographed in magazines and newspapers. They were photographed shopping along the Champs-Élysées. They were photographed in nightclubs, at sporting events. They were one of the foremost celebrity couples in Paris during the 1930s. However, after the Nazis conquered France, Mireille Ballin decided that her future lay not with Victor Young Perez, because he was Jewish, but rather with the Nazis. And she felt that that would be better for her career. So she abandoned Victor and became the lover of a Nazi SS officer. As bad as that was for Victor, what was even worse is that she betrayed him to her new Nazi lover, and that resulted in Victor being sent to Auschwitz. And from Auschwitz, he was sent to a subcamp of Auschwitz called Monowitz, which was a labor camp where that was run by the IG Farben chemical company, and he was forced to build things for the chemical company. And he was treated very badly. He was malnourished. He was often beaten. And eventually they discovered that he had been a boxing champion. And the SS guards decided that for their entertainment, they would have him box other people in the camp. But before he could box other inmates in the camp, they put him in a ring with an SS guard. And the SS guard was twice Victor's size. And Victor was emaciated at this point because they were virtually starving the workers to death. And this SS guard was pummeling Victor so badly that it looked like Victor was about to die. However, the SS guards of the camp permitted a number of Jewish inmates to observe this beating. And they were told that they couldn't lift their faces to watch, but they had to keep their heads down. But they managed to raise their eyes and look up at what was going on. And they felt sorry for Victor. And because he was known as young Victor, since he was such a young athlete, they began chanting his name, young, young, young. And this inspired Victor. And he managed to find strength within himself, God knows where it came from, to defeat this SS guard who was twice his size. And the SS guards at the camp were infuriated about this. And so they made sure that he would only fight other Jewish inmates, because they had this idea that if you're a German Aryan, you shouldn't be in a position of being beaten by a member of a subhuman race. And they considered Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and others to be subhuman. And it looked bad for them if one of these subhumans were to defeat an Aryan who they regarded as Superman. And he had 140 fights while he was a prisoner in Auschwitz. And amazingly, he won all 140 fights. The alternative to not winning, the alternative to winning rather, would have been that he would have been dragged off to the gas chambers and killed. And that's what happened to his opponents. And this was a terrible predicament for all of these boxers, because they were put in a position where if they didn't fight, they would be killed. But if they fought and won, their opponent would be killed. So it was a terrible choice that they were given, and their own survival instincts forced them to go on fighting, even though they knew that their opponents would die. As the war was winding down and the Allies were closing in on the Nazis decided to evacuate their concentration camps. And rather than using their soldiers to fight the Allies, which would have been a smart thing to do militarily, they used these soldiers to evacuate the camps, because they wanted the inmates at the camps to be used as slave laborers back in Germany. So they had what were called death marches, where people were marched out of these camps, and anyone who fell along the way was immediately killed. No one was helped, and they marched for hours and hours and days, wearing just rags and often barefoot in the middle of winter. And along this march, Victor was marching, and he saw a stale loaf of bread off to one side of the road. And he went to pick up this loaf of bread to feed himself and some of his colleagues who were marching with him. And an SS guard saw him and ran up behind him and shot him twice in the head and killed him. He was just 33 years old at the time. Now, the other person who I wrote about, excuse my dog just started barking. The other person who I wrote about was a man named Nathan Schaphow. Nathan Schaphow was born in Riga, Latvia. He was a natural athlete. He was big and he was strong, and he performed in a number of different sports, including boxing. And when the Nazis came, and took over Latvia. They moved in after the Russians had moved out. They created a ghetto in which all the Jewish residents were very, very badly treated. And Hoffman was, Nathan Chapau was particularly disliked by an SS man whose last name was Hoffman. Hoffman didn't like him because the Chapau carried himself with such self-confidence and such strength that Hoffman hated him. And he used to occasionally come up behind Chapau and hit him over the head with a stick or a club. And one day he followed followed Chapau into his home, and he pushed Chapau against a wall and sort of spread eagled him. And at that moment, Chapau turned around to look at Hoffman, and he saw that Hoffman was pulling a Luger pistol out of his holster. And Chapau realized that Hoffman was about to shoot him. Chapau quickly went over to Hoffman and with one punch knocked him unconscious. He grabbed the pistol and was about to shoot him, but then realized that if he shot him, the sound of the gunfire would draw other SS guards. So instead, he picked up a lamp and he beat Hoffman, fracturing his skull and killing him. And then he wrapped the body in a sheet and waited until about 3 o'clock in the morning, and then dragged the body to a nearby alley, hoping that no one would find it for several days. However, an SS soldier found it the next morning and called all the Jewish men of Riga, or as many of them as they could round up, into the town square. And they demanded that the person who killed Hoffman step forward. And if that person didn't step forward, they would pick 2 men by random and hang them in the town square. Well, now Chapau was faced with a terrible dilemma. He realized that if he stepped forward, he would be executed. And if he didn't step forward, 2 innocent men would be hanged. And he too, like Victor Perez, had a strong survival instinct and did not step forward. And 2 innocent men were dragged from the lines and put in the center of the town and put on a box and they were hanged. This haunted Nathan Chapau for the rest of his life. It was just a terrible event for him, but he felt that he had no choice but to do this. Shortly thereafter, the SS in Riga, they gathered up 25,000 Jewish residents of Riga, and they marched them into the Rumbala forest, where all 25,000 of them were machine gunned to death. And Chapau was not one of them, fortunately, but he was arrested and taken to a concentration camp called Kaiserwald. And because of his strength and his athletic ability, they made him a concentration camp boxer. And the first person that they had him box was a man named Werner Samuel, who was a middleweight boxing champion from Germany. And they thought for sure he would beat up Chapau, and then they would wind up killing Chapau. However, Chapau managed to beat Werner Samuel, and no one knows what happened to Samuel after that. He may have been killed, he may not have been killed. From the Kaiserwald concentration camp, Chapau was transported to another concentration camp called the Stutthof concentration camp. And as he was getting off the disembarking from the freight train that brought him and many other Jews to the camp, the guards were singing a song, and this is the song that they sang. Jews go through the Red Sea, the waves close in, and the world is happy, Jews are drowned. And they would sing this over and over and over again. And he was forced to box there as well. And in that camp, when the rather than having a death march, they forced 50,000 Jews into the water that surrounded the camp and they machine gunned all 50,000 of them while they were in the water. Schapau managed to escape along with a couple of other people. And along the way, he was almost captured by a Nazi soldier, but was able to kill the soldier. And from there, he was sent to a displaced persons camp after the war. And he migrated to what was then called Mandate Palestine, where he joined an underground Jewish army called the Irgun that was fighting against the British, who would not let Jews in there. And finally, when the British left, he joined the Israeli Defense Forces, and he fought for Jewish independence in 1948. While he was there, he met his wife, he got married, he had 2 children, he left Israel and moved to Chicago. And from Chicago, he moved to Los Angeles, where he opened a trucking company that became very successful. I was very fortunate that I was able to interview his son, Mike Schapau, who gave me a great deal of information about his father. And one of the things he said, that though his father was haunted by the experience of the 2 men that were hanged in Riga, he was just so grateful to be alive, to be able to look at the sun, to smell the air, and to have the freedom to go where and when he wanted to. And he had, as a result of this, he had just a wonderful love of life, which other people found infectious. They just loved having him around because he was such a joy to be with. The next person I wrote about was a man named Salomo Aruch. He was by age 17, he became the heavyweight champion, middleweight champion of Greece. And he was from Salonika in Greece, which had the largest Jewish population of any city in Greece. And he had fought against the Italian fascists with the Greek army and helped to drive them out of Greece. But then the Nazis came and defeated the Greek army, and the Nazi occupation of Greece began. And the Nazis sent a man who was, after the war, condemned as a war criminal, named Alois Brunner. And his job was to round up all the Jews of Salonika and send them to concentration camps, which he did. And Salomo was one of those who was rounded up and sent. But by the way, after the war, even though Alois Brunner was condemned as a war criminal, he managed to escape because there were some members of the Vatican who ran what was called a rat line, which helped Nazi war criminals escape justice. And he wound up in Syria, where he joined the Ba'ath Party. And as a member of the Ba'ath Party, his job was to take captured Israeli soldiers and torture them and then murder them. He had no other job but doing that. On March 15th, 1943, Salomo, his father, his mother, his sisters, and brother all arrived at Auschwitz, and all but Salomo were immediately sent to the gas chambers where they were killed. Salomo was put into a ring where he had to fight an enormous fighter from Czechoslovakia. And he beat the fighter, much to the surprise of everyone there. And as a result of that, he was given special treatment. They gave him a little more food than the other inmates had. And they let him actually train for fights. And they then brought in another fighter who they thought for sure would beat Salomo. He was a German boxer who had won 100 bouts back in Germany. His name was Klaus Silber. And once again, Salomo beat this fighter. Next, they brought in a man who was also a successful Greek Jewish fighter named Jacko Razon, who had won 120 fights in Greece. And both he and Salomo had been friends since they were teenagers. And everyone wanted to see this fight. Fortunately for these two men, the Allies were able to liberate the camp before the fight took place. As soon as the camp was liberated, Salamo made his way to Mandate, Palestine, where he too joined the Israeli Defense Forces, and he fought for Israeli independence in 1948, and then he fought in the Six-Day War in 1967. He had a family and children in Israel and had a successful business there. He died of a stroke in 2009. The next person I wrote about, he was not a Jewish fighter, he was a gypsy. And they don't like the term gypsy. They like to be known either as Sinti or as Romas. And the one I wrote about, his name was Johann Trollman, and he was a Sinti. He was, because he was swarthy, he had dark black curly hair, and he wasn't pale or fair-skinned the way most Germans were. He was often picked on in school because of his race. And as a result of that, his father sent him to a boxing gym where he could be trained to defend himself against the classroom bullies he faced. And he was trained by a man named Erich Seelig, who was a German Jewish boxing champion during the 1930s and was forced out of Germany when the Nazis came to power. He wound up becoming a farmer in New Jersey in the 1940s. But he did a terrific job of training Johann, and Johann became a terrific boxer. He developed a style of boxing, which if you've ever watched Muhammad Ali fight, it would be very similar. He danced around the ring. He would, as they said, float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. He danced around so gracefully that he was known as the ballerina of the boxing ring. And it was very hard for an opponent to hit him. But the German style of boxing was to stand in the center of the ring flat-footed and just trade punches with your opponent. Well, this was not for Johann. This is not what he wanted to do at all. And he had a title fight for the light heavyweight championship of Germany. And he fought a man named Adolf Witt, and he beat him and became the light heavyweight champion of Germany. Well, the Nazis were so upset about this that they took away his championship title the next day. However, there were a lot of protests about this. So they said, okay, we'll give you back the title temporarily, but you have to fight with the way Witt fights, not the way you fight. And you better make sure also that you lose the fight, because if you don't lose the fight, we're going to kill you. Well, Johann had an unusual sense of humor. He entered the boxing ring with his hair dyed blonde, and he had baking powder all over his body. And this was a parody of a German Aryan, pale-skinned and blonde. And this drew a lot of laughter from people in the stands. And he stood there and traded punches with Adolf Witt. And as expected, he lost the fight, and Adolf Witt was declared the light heavyweight champion. Next, Johann Trollman was drafted into the Wehrmacht and sent to fight on the Eastern Front. And he was badly wounded and sent home to recover. While he was recovering at home, he received a message that he was no longer wanted in the army, that he was useless to them because he had been wounded. And so they were going to send him to a concentration camp. And at around that time, they started sending all the Sinti and Roma of Germany to concentration camps because they were regarded as subhumans. And whereas the Jews had to wear a yellow star or a yellow triangle in the concentration camps, the Gypsies had to wear a brown triangle, and the homosexuals had to wear a pink triangle, and the Jehovah's Witnesses had to wear a red triangle. They had a different color for each group that they imprisoned in the concentration camps. And he was so badly beaten in Auschwitz that his friends there decided that they had to get him out of there or he would be killed by the SS guards. And so when another inmate died, they said that that inmate was Johann Trollman, and they gave him Trollman's name, and they gave Trollman that person's name, and that person was cremated, and Trollman's family was given a bill for the cremation, and they thought that their son and brother had died in Auschwitz. But his friends who arranged for this substitution also arranged for him to be sent to another concentration camp called Wittenberg. And he was recognized there as the former light heavyweight champion. And he had a number of fights there, all of which he won. However, there was a capo at this camp named Emil Cornelius, who hated Trollman and used to treat him very badly. And the SS guards decided that Cornelius and Trollman should have a boxing match. And they did, and Trollman beat Cornelius, even though Cornelius was bigger and stronger and a lot healthier than Trollman. Well, Cornelius was so humiliated by his loss that one day he snuck up behind Cornelius and beat him to death over the head with a club. And that was the end of Trollman. He was just 36 years old at the time. The next person I wrote about in the book was someone I mentioned at the beginning who led me into this study, a man named Harry Haft, who was from Poland. And his first encounter with the SS consisted of an SS guard grabbing him in his Polish town and sticking his hand in a doorway and pressing his fingers up against the door jamb and then slamming the door against his fingers, breaking all the fingers in one hand. He was arrested and sent to Auschwitz, and he was given a job there of taking bodies that came out of the gas chambers and putting them into ovens where they would be incinerated. And one day, one of the bodies that he was supposed to push into the ovens, he noticed the man was still alive. His eyes were open. And Trollman didn't want to put him, Haft didn't want to put him in an oven. And the SS guard said, if you don't put him in the oven, we're going to kill you. So Haft had to push this man into an oven and slammed the door. And he heard the man scream briefly, and then the man was incinerated. The next person he put in the oven was dead, and it was that man's wife. Haft was at this point really psychologically destroyed by this work that he had to do. Nevertheless, because he was extremely strong, he was very athletic looking and very, very muscular, they put him together with other inmates, and he had to have a number of fights there. He had 76 bare knuckle bouts, and he won all of them. And during these bouts, the guards assembled a group of inmates who were musicians, all violinists, and they had to provide violin music while these bouts were going on for the entertainment of the SS guards who were watching. Now, you know, most professional fighters have a bout maybe every 3 or 4 months. Harry Haft was forced at one point to have 6 bouts in one night, and he managed to win all 6 bouts. He was desperate to get out of Auschwitz and managed to escape. And during his journey to escape, he was crossing a small river, and there was an SS man bathing in the river. And the SS man recognized Harry Haft as an escaped prisoner and began to run out of the river to grab his gun, his rifle, which was on the side of the river, to kill Haft. How Haft grabbed the rifle before the soldier did, and he was able to shoot the soldier and kill him. He then dressed in the soldier's uniform, figuring that this would protect him in case he ran into any other Germans. And he wound up in a displaced persons camp at the end of the war. And initially they thought he was a Nazi soldier, and he couldn't speak German, and he couldn't speak English, and he could just speak Yiddish. And the American soldiers were able to find another American soldier who was conversant in Yiddish, and he was able to speak to Haft and realize that Haft was Polish and not a German, and he was only disguising himself as a German officer in order to escape the Nazis. And after he left the displaced persons camp, he sailed to New York and arrived in Brooklyn, where he decided that he would become a professional boxer. Since he had been arrested when he was 16, he had no other training for a profession. The only thing he knew was to box, which he learned in Auschwitz. He moved in with relatives, and he was able to hire a boxing manager, and he had a number of amateur fights and then a number of professional fights. And then in 1949, on July 18th, 1949, at an auditorium in Rhode Island, he was scheduled to have a fight with a man named Rocky Marciano, who a few years later would become the world heavyweight boxing champion in America. And just before the fight, 3 mobsters went into Harry Haft's dressing room, and they told him that if he didn't lose the fight, they would kill him. And he knew that this was true because they had killed another boxer who refused to take a dive a few weeks earlier. So Harry Haft didn't take the dive initially in the first round when they wanted him to, but he did do in the 3rd round. And that was the end of his boxing career. He figured that he had survived 76 bouts in Auschwitz, and now he was completely destroyed by the mafia in New York, and this was just too much for him. He moved to Brooklyn, where he opened a fruit and vegetable store, and he became very abusive to his wife and his 2 sons. He was such an angry man. He was angry all the time. He had a hair-trigger temper, and he often took it out on his wife and children. It wasn't until his sons were older that they realized why their father was so vicious to them, and they were able to forgive him. And one of his sons, Alan, sent me a letter that he wrote to his father, and I found this a very, very touching letter, and I'd like to read it to you. Dear Popsy, you've been gone 12 years, and I miss not having a father. Growing up, you beat me for my childish behavior. The rage you had inside you often took out on me. I feared your very presence. You broke furniture and punched out windows, abused Mom to no end. Despite the abuse, Mom always protected you, excused your behavior because of your background. I could not excuse you until I learned what that background was. I was ashamed of you. You could not read or write. You spoke broken English with a thick accent, and you had those green numbers on your arm. I wish I knew then what I know now. You suffered terribly at the hands of the Nazis. You saw horror and were forced to participate in it. After you told me all about your ordeal, what you had to do just to live another day, it helped me understand why you were who you were and are who you are. I now see how sorry you are for the abuse. How can anyone judge you? They call you a Holocaust survivor, but does anyone really survive? It has been said that the Nazis murdered your soul. Popsy, I have spent my later years trying to make the world better for you. Your story was published by Syracuse University Press. You were inducted into the Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. There is a major motion picture about your life. I know that you would have been happy that I made you famous. Despite the physical and psychological abuse, I would want you to know I forgive you. Mom died this summer. She was the angel sent by God to care for you. Now it's your turn to take care of her. Love, Alan. I not only found that a very touching letter, but it was amazing to me the maturity of the son who was able to finally forgive his father and to understand the cause of his father's anger. The next section of my book dealt with men who were in Auschwitz and managed to escape. I profiled 2 in particular. One was a man named Rudy Verba, who was a brilliant biochemist who managed to escape and write a report about the atrocities that were going on. He gave that report to a diplomat in Slovakia, where he lived. He managed to escape back to Slovakia. The diplomat was from a Central American country. That diplomat gave the report to a diplomat in Switzerland, and that diplomat made the report available to all the newspapers in Switzerland, where it was reported, and then it was reported in newspapers in England and the United States. And there were massive demonstrations then, as a result, in Switzerland, the United States, and in Great Britain. The United States Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau brought the report to Franklin Roosevelt, and the report indicated that massive numbers of Hungarian Jews were being sent to Auschwitz to be exterminated, and several 100,000 had already met that fate. However, the Jews of Budapest had yet to be sent to Auschwitz, and Roosevelt sent a telegram to Admiral Horthy, who was the regent of Hungary, and was really a Nazi puppet. And Roosevelt said that if any more Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz, that the American and British Air Force would bomb every Nazi target in and around Budapest, as well as the Hungarian military facilities. So Horthy stopped the evacuation of Jews to Auschwitz, and that in effect saved the lives of 100,000 Jews in Budapest. The other man who was interesting, he was not Jewish. He was a Polish Catholic named Witold Pilecki, who was a member of the Polish Home Army, who was strongly anti-fascist. And Pilecki came from a very wealthy, renowned family in Poland. And when he heard rumors about the atrocities being committed in Auschwitz, he put himself in a position of being arrested and sent to Auschwitz. And he stayed there for 2.5 years, sending out secret messages to the Polish Home Army in exile in London, and even built a ham radio set, which it took the Nazis a while to discover it. And he broadcast to the Polish Home Army in London. After 2.5 years, he and 3 other Polish inmates managed to escape. And 2 of them had families. The Nazis knew who these people were, by the way, after they escaped. And they couldn't find them, but they found the parents of 2 of the escapees, and they arrested them because the parents wouldn't or couldn't reveal where their sons were. And so the Nazis, once they captured the parents, they quickly executed them in Auschwitz. Pilecki made his way back to Warsaw, where he rejoined the Polish Home Army, and he fought vigorously against the Nazis. And after the Nazis were driven out of Poland, eventually the Soviets came in and took over Poland. And Pilecki was as much an anti-communist as he was an anti-fascist. And so the Soviets arrested him, and they tortured him terribly. They pulled out all of his fingernails with the pliers. They pulled out all of his toenails with the pliers. They put electrodes on his testicles and electrocuted him for a while. And they forced him to sign a confession that he was a traitor. And after he signed this false confession, they had a trial that wasn't a trial, where, of course, he was found guilty, and then he was executed. And he was a non-person in Poland until after the Soviets left Poland and a secular government came in under Lech Walesa. And all of a sudden, they realized what a hero Witold Pilecki had been, and they built a statue to him in Warsaw. And he is declared a World War II and Holocaust hero in Poland. The next group that I wrote about was a group called the Avengers, and it was started in Vilna in Lithuania by a man named Abba Kovner. When the Nazis took over Lithuania, he realized what their intentions were towards the Jewish population, and he wrote a manifesto called "Let Us Not Go Like Lambs to the Slaughter." And most of the Jews of Vilna thought this is absurd. Germans are a civilized people. They're not going to exterminate the Jews. Oh, they may send us to a labor camp, or they may send us to another country, but they're not going to exterminate us. They're not going to eliminate us. So most of the Jews did not listen to Abba Kovner. However, a sufficient number did, and he was able to form them into an underground army called the Avengers. And they were able to smuggle a lot of weapons into the Vilna ghetto, and also smuggle out a number of the inhabitants. Eventually, they all left the ghetto, and they joined Russian partisans in fighting against the Nazis. And then, after that, they went off on their own, and they worked in the forests of Lithuania and Latvia and other Eastern countries. And they sabotaged, they committed acts of sabotage against the German army. They killed German soldiers. And they continued doing that up through the end of World War II. And after the war, up until 1951, they became a paramilitary group that sought out Nazi war criminals and killed them. They often dressed as British soldiers and went to the homes of Nazi war criminals who were unindicted, usually low-level guards from the concentration camps. And they said you were wanted for questioning at a British army base. And they even had a car with a British insignia on it. And they would drive that war criminal into the woods, and they would force that person out of the car, march him into the woods, and say, you know the crimes you committed, and now we've come to deliver justice to you. And they would make that person kneel down in the woods and shoot that person in the head. They were able to execute 1,500 Nazi war criminals between 1945 and 1951. After that, Abba Kovner went to live in Israel, where he became the poet laureate of Israel. He was an excellent writer. What the Avengers did was taken over by the Mossad, which is the equivalent of the American CIA. And they went and killed about 2,000 additional Nazi war criminals, including a notorious one known as the Beast of Riga, named Herbert Kukers, who was living as a travel agent in Brazil at the time. During the war, he had rounded up about 600 Jews and locked them into a barn and set the barn on fire, killing all of them. When the Mossad finally caught up with him, they executed him, and they sent out a press release announcing it to all the world, saying that this is what we've done to one of the world's worst war criminals, and we want you to know that if there are additional war criminals out there, we're coming to get you. And that's pretty much how my book ends. Oh, it ends actually with the trial of major Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg after the war. So anyway, if you have any questions, I would be very happy to answer whatever questions you may have.
I just made it so you can unmute if you want and ask a question, or you can type it in the chat and I can read it.
Okay. Well, Jeff, I do have a question. Those stories are so horrifying and moving. I just wondered which ones touched you the most? And, you know, I mean, how did you relate to all these people? There must be some that stood out with their heroism or their courage, strength, you know, that those assets.
The one who fascinated me the most was Victor Young Perez, because he had achieved such celebrity in Paris in the 1930s, and suffered so terribly because of a betrayal. Mm. The others pretty much followed the same pattern of, because they were Jewish, they were arrested and they were sent to Auschwitz, or one because he was a gypsy and sent to Auschwitz. But Victor Perez's story was tragic, almost by comparison, in that he had reached a certain great height and then fallen to the depths. The others had not reached the height that he had, and yet they were also taken into the depths. So I was fascinated by what happened to Victor Perez, and I think his story would make a terrific movie, by the way.
Yeah, it would. No questions? My goodness.
Nobody has any questions?
We just got one.
Okay.
Charlotte wants to know, how did you do most of your research and how many survivors could you speak with?
I've spoken to a number of Holocaust survivors, but not any who boxed in the concentration camps. I did get to interview the sons of Harry Haft and Nathan Chapow, and the information they provided was extremely interesting and very revealing. The other research that I did, I had a reference librarian who was able to dig up a lot of information from old newspapers and magazines, and in old French newspapers, I had a friend who was able to translate those newspapers for me, because there was a lot of information in European publications, and it was hard to find them, but I was able, through the help of a reference librarian, to locate a lot of them.